We have a nice agenda for you today. We will get started with two examples of foundational models that have drawn some interest within the community and are testimony to the interest in general that there is in the community on this subject. And then we're going to touch the meat of the presentation, which is really the mapping of the world of foundational models by category and by data, ultimately to help you select the right model for your specific use case. We'll show you how we drew this map. We actually created this map using a foundational model, so it's fair to say that we are organizing foundational models using foundational models. And then we'll show you the curated database we use as a basis for that, how to use it to find your model, and then as sort of icing on the cake, we're going to show you a Llama 3 locally running LLM. That is the basis for a recommendation app that runs in a Streamlit implementation. So this is basically the second webinar we're having on this LLM foundational model topic. The first one was really about single cell GPT, was last month. And we showed you how to use single cell GPT to understand the predictions of gene perturbations using single cell GPT. And during that webinar, we asked several poll questions. And the second one was I wanted to show you today, which is what is the main barrier for using foundational models in your work? That's what we asked last time. And the results were that a significant amount of people responded that they don't know enough about it and are feeling overwhelmed. The other answer that is of interest for this specific webinar today was I am worried about the privacy and security aspects of those foundational models. So those two aspects of the answers we're basically going to touch upon in today's webinar. So let's start with that. So let's start with two foundational models, LavaMed and AlphaFold 3. Soliciting significant excitement in the field. Dror will start with the first one. So go ahead, Dror.
Yes, thank you. So one very exciting domain of foundational models are domains that surround the protein structure prediction. And I think the most famous one is AlphaFold, which just recently came up to its AlphaFold 3 version. And unlike the previous version, this version of AlphaFold was trained not only on predicting protein structure from amino acid sequences, but also on all kind of ligand, nucleic acid, ions, and other modified residues from a lot of different databases. And it can predict a biomolecular interaction, which is super important, for example, for drug discovery. And it can predict, for example, the location of a specific drug inside the active site of a protein. So this is a very exciting trend. And one thing that worth mentioning is that it's basically a multimodal model that can take in not only the protein sequences, but as I said, you can put in small molecules sequences, covalent bonds, templates, and you get out a joint structure of the entire complex with explicit atomic positions and confidence score. And the main addition that I had in these models is this new module that's called diffusion module, which come after the previous AlphaFold, and it makes your prediction both more accurate and also allow this multimolecular structure.
Right, and the second example is that of LavaMed. It is also a multimodal model which can analyze images as well as text. And this specific implementation, for example, allows you to add an image from the domain, from the medical domain, in this case, for example, a chest X-ray, and you can then ask questions about those images. So, for example, you would be able to ask, are there any devices implanted in this patient? And the model would then understand this natural language, would be able to translate it into features in the image, analyze the image, and have a conversation about that. So it would answer, well, for example, yes, it appears that the patient has several devices implanted, and it would then go on and list those devices, and you can have a follow-up conversation about those devices or whatever it is you want to ask about them. And the way they developed this model is to take a foundational model called Lava as a starting point, and that model can out of the box understand like a wide array of images and being able to describe those images in text. But so that is great, but it's not fine-tuned. It's not very adapted for the medical domain. So the change that they made to the model is by training it in stage one, really with medical images, really being able to understand the medical jargon and being able to generate insights about medical images. And the second stage is really to have the conversational aspect, so the instructions part of the model for the medical domain. So both those stages together, working in tandem, can really make this model work in the way that I showed before. Let's move on to sort of the meat of the presentation, if you will, and it's really about, okay, so we have a lot of models that are coming out on a, I wouldn't say daily basis, but at least like every week there's at least a model, and that pace is accelerating all the time. And so, as we saw in the poll before, people are a little bit overwhelmed in terms of what models are out there, which model to choose. So we've made an overview of those models. And we assembled from the internet 59 of those models, and they cross 7 domains. And all in all, they cover 837 use cases. And these use cases are the use cases that are specifically described in the articles that are associated with those models. And so you can see that there are various domains: genomics and genetic analysis, epigenetics, single cell and multi-omics analysis. For example, the single cell GPT model we described in last webinar is in that category, in that domain. We have molecular structures and interactions. AlphaFold is there, AlphaFold 3. Drug discovery and biomedical applications. We have imaging. LavaMed is right there. And it is just the first step of sort of mapping this world of foundational models for you. And we then made an interactive tool for you that allows you to interactively travel and explore this space. And it looks something like that. It's right now available on our website. The link is right below. It has the 7 domains that I mentioned before, subdomains for each of those domains, and the different use cases that are different models that are associated with the use case, including a link to the GitHub repo of each of those models. So, right. So this is a tool, again, you can go to the website, you can look at there, it'll be there all the time, ready for you to be used. And that is organizing this world of foundational models by domain. The other way you can organize the world of foundational models is by looking at the input and output types. So for example, you can say, well, we're looking at molecules or sequences or structure, table, and text, what kind of content that input has, for example, gene relationship and things like that. And then you can also look at the output of the model, and that brings you to a specific use case and a specific model that you can then, of course, also access the Git repo of this model. So these are 2 ways that you can organize foundational models, and we found that the second one, like looking at the input and the output, is actually the most helpful one because the use cases are most readily mapped to the input and output more than just some semantic definition of a domain. So let's go further. Right. So now we're going to show you how we built this map using foundational models.
Yeah. Okay, so when we thought about creating a database, a map of all the foundation models, you might ask, maybe you can just ask ChatGPT to find the right model for you. And in some cases you can, but we found out that ChatGPT and GPT-4 in particular is very, very creative. So you get a lot of hallucinations and oversimplification. So you want to ground it in the literature. So you probably want to do some manual collection of the literature, and Then you want to structure the database in a way that make it easier for you to search for and to understand later on. Okay, so what we did is first we collected about 150 different papers from already existing list of all kinds of foundational models in different domains that we collected from GitHub. And we ran using GPT-4 API a prompt like that says, okay, these are the articles, summarize the article, and identify the different results and use cases, and explain why this is a foundational model. And we got a very nice description of what exactly are the results and the inputs on each of these papers. And manually we selected 59 that look very promising and also have a broad domains of biomedical research. Okay, so then you can take these 59 and take the summary that you get from each one of them using the previous stage, and you put it through the ChatGPT and ask it with a very long and complicated prompt to basically get you all the downstream application. And it says that in specific paper, it finds things like predict gene interaction network from pathway enrichment tables. And we get more than 1,000 of these. But after a few iterations, what you usually want to do is to make it more consistent in its terminology, because GPT-4 tend to be very creative, as I said. And for example, it called the same thing in different terms, like annotated cell types, identified and labeled cell types, identification of distinct cell type or state. So after one round, I told him take all these similar concepts and make it just cell type annotation. So you can minimize it to a much smaller number of use cases. And then you want to formalize it even more. And like Daniel said before, after a few trials, we figure out that the best way to cluster the models and say which models are in the same domain or in different domains is looking on the input and output. And you can also use GPT-4 to do that. And again, you put your downstream application into it and try to formalize the different inputs and outputs. And in this stage also, you will probably want to do some manual curation that, like before, take very similar phrases like protein expression data or gene transcription data and say, okay, all of these are called gene expression. And you end up with a very clear and organized input-output structure of your database, and you can easily cluster it to different domains based on the different input and output that this model gets. Okay, so we assemble the database. So how do you use it to find the right model for you? So what you can actually download right now from our website is the table that we have created, which is here you see it in Google Docs, which contain the different models with the use cases and the input output and the domain and everything you need. You can just filter the different domain in order to look it up. Okay, so basically what you want to do is to take some question that you have, some scientific problem, and try to figure out what is the domain and what is the input that you have. So for example, if your question is, I have gene expression data from single-cell RNA sequencing of immune cells treated with various drugs, how can I predict the cellular response of these drugs? So this is the kind of question people might have. And the domain is obviously single cells, multi-omic analysis, and the input will be gene expression table. And if you filter it through our database, you probably get single cell GPT or similar model from the list. So this is how it probably will look like. In reality, you go to the spreadsheet and you just do filtering and you get your results based on the either the input, output, or the domain, or both. So this is something that you can do right now.
Right. So The next step, so these are the resources that we have available for you. So the database itself, the ability to query it using filters, and the interactive map. So we also have a tool that is an LLM-based querying tool of this specific database in which you can ask a question in natural language. And then we had a foundational model called Llama 3 in the domain of NLP, of course, that can interpret that question and interrogate the database accordingly. And the reason why we use Llama 3 and not GPT-4o, for example, is basically for data privacy and cost. So as you know, when you query GPT-4o, you send a prompt outside of the deployment, and that may be a problem because the queries that you may want to add, they contain sensitive information, perhaps. They pertain to plans that you might have for the future, questions about the specific data, problems that you're dealing with. So it's fair to assume that these are private data that you do not want to expose, and you certainly do not want OpenAI to start training on these queries so that the next version of their model will have that data available for all the entire world to see. So you certainly do not want to have that. And so that's one reason why we used a locally running model, Llama 3, within your deployment, so no query gets out. And the other consideration is really cost, because Llama 3 is free to use, right? You don't have to pay for it. You do have to pay for the compute, the GPU you need to spin up to analyze, to run the model, but that's another story. So now, once we have this no-code application, right, where you can add a query and get an answer, the question is, how good is this tool functioning? And how do you know how good it is, and what is the strategy to test that? And the strategy is as follows. So we take 59 models, like the ones that we described, we assembled in the database. We extract a sample downstream application from the article, so 59 of those. And then we generate using GPT-4 3 variations of that downstream application. For example, if the downstream application would be predict answers to medical questions from medical images, and the variations could be, for example, given a collection of CT scans from patients with different stages of lung cancer, how can I classify the cancer stages and fine-tune to my problem, which is a very specific use case that we know is by definition related, is originating from a specific, in this case, the blue model. So we have sort of built a ground truth, if you will, and we can then use that ground truth to test the efficiency of Llama 3 to trace it back from the query to the model. So we define success as Llama 3. So Llama 3 creates 4 options for you, 4 models that it thinks is the best. And success in our mind is that if the right model appears in one of those 4 options. Now, the reason to choose 4 and let's say 20 is because in our UI, we cannot show so many models, and it would be sort of a bad UX to have users scroll through so many models, and 4 is sort of a reasonable amount to review. So that's exactly what we did. We got to an accuracy of 98% given that criteria. And the app looks like, again, it runs in Streamlit. You ask a question in natural language, click Find Model, and you get the recommendation models, like the 4 different models that we recommend, and also an explanation why this model was chosen, as well as a link to the GitHub, and also a summary of the specific model that was the models that were chosen, as you can see here in the movie. So all in all, this is a nice tool that runs on CodeOcean, is available for our customers. And so moving ahead, so in terms of next steps, so what we've shown you is you can get a recommendation for a model, which is great, but of course, it's not the end of the story. Right? What you really would want to have is a recommendation, and then also the ability to implement that recommendation, this model, in your specific workflow and run it and get a result. And so in the jargon of CodeOcean, that would mean that this recommendation is then transformed into a compute capsule, which is the reproducible compute capsule that is the foundation of CodeOcean, which is an encapsulation of the data, the code, and the computer environment all together, that is executable with a single click. And so that's basically where we're taking this project from recommendation all the way to an executable capsule that runs securely in your own deployment. So, and then it will show up in your dashboard, and you can use it in pipelines or to run an experiment, like whatever you choose to do, share it. All right. So in conclusion, we have tried to help you to map all of the, not all of the, but most of the most important foundational models that are out there right now. We got to 59 that cover 7 different domains, almost 1,000 different downstream use cases. And we can tell you that the most relevant way to organize those models is using the input and output of those models. And we've created 2 free resources that are available right now from our website. One is the database itself. You can download it as a CSV file. You can use it in ChatGPT. You can try to do whatever you want. You can filter it using Google Docs and use it to get to the model that you want to work with. And we also have a free interactive map that allows you to dynamically explore the database that I just mentioned. And we also have this free app that runs on Streamlit. It's available for our customers, and it has a locally running LLM, Llama 3, that allows you to privately and securely create queries and get a recommendation for the model to use given your use case.